Beyond the Yellow Fog by Emmett McDowell. Part 3 of 8. This story appeared in Planet Stories, spring of 1947. Extensive research by Project Gutenberg at Gutenberg.org did not uncover any evidence that the copyright on this publication was renewed. Chapter 3. Gavin Murdoch drew a deep breath. He didn't move. The girl must have carried the gun strapped around her leg above the knee. In that costume, it wouldn't have been invisible any place else, though it's not like he was looking below her little booby shells. He said, "It's your move." Without answering him, the girl said, "Change of address, pit 7. "Change of address, pit 7. The metallic voice of the cab repeated through the speaker overhead. Gavin felt like a blind man playing chess. He narrowed his pale blue eyes. "Where are we going?" "The Nova." Her face was unfriendly. "But the Nova's at pit 9. "Pit 9's being watched. We're going to use the underground." Gavin shifted slightly, half turning towards the girl. "Point that dart gun some other direction," he complained. "My blood's running cold." She didn't move it. Gavin's long arm snapped out with the precision of a cat's paw, slapped the gun out of her hands. The girl gasped, "Oh!" snatched for the weapon, but Gavin's hand was already covering it. The gun in his possession, he asked, "Who's watching the Nova?" "As if you didn't know." Gavin considered this, examining the dart gun at the same time. It was a tiny thing, curved to fit the roundness of a leg, beautiful as a jewel. "Does it shoot around corners if it's curved?" "Oddly enough," he returned dryly, "I don't know." She glared at him through the semi-gloom without replying. The buildings flowed past the windows, the green glow of lichens and moss illuminating the street with about the same intensity as a full moon's light on Terra. Gavin made his voice cold as he leaned toward the girl. "Do you want me to loosen your tongue for you? Who's watching the Nova?" Nadia gasped, her hands at her throat. "You know as well as I do. X's men." "Who's X?" "Who's X? You ask that? You went to see him this afternoon. You even made an appointment with him later." Gavin recalled the words he had spoken for the benefit of X's men as he left the bar. "I'll see you later, then." Captain Cabot was not without his own spy system, after all. His estimation of Cabot went up a notch. "You won't believe this," he said, "but I haven't the foggiest notion who X is. Do you know?" Nadia's dark eyes looked puzzled. She shook her head, gave a short laugh. "You're going to be a big disappointment to Josiah. I wouldn't care to be in your shoes." "Josiah? Oh, you're referring to Captain Cabot. So he expects me to be able to tell him who X represents." "You were talking to him," said the girl bluntly. Gavin regarded Nadia a moment, then he asked, "Why has the sailing been advanced?" She clamped shut her jaws. "You don't want me to force you to talk, do you?" suggested Gavin. "You wouldn't dare." "Wouldn't I?" Nadia bit her lip. "It doesn't make any difference, I suppose." She shrugged. "You know anyway if you're working for X. Captain found out that some powerful clique is trying to have the Nova interned. He rushed his clearance through before they had time to act." She paused before adding, "X has bought off Trev." So it was the Martian who had sold out, not Nadia. He handed back the girl's dart gun. "Here, see if you can't behave yourself now." Nadia took the weapon. She pointed it deliberately at Gavin's chest. "Please clasp your hands behind your neck." The robot cab drew up to the curb. The door opened. Its voice issued from the loudspeaker. "Pit 7." "Get out," Nadia ordered. "Stand back from the door." Gavin slid out. The buildings were gone, replaced by a wall of structural concrete which disappeared overhead in the clouds. It had begun to rain again, a clammy drizzle. The girl followed him to the curb, shivering as the drops hit her bare shoulders and back. A green-lighted sign over a door in the concrete wall read, "Pit 7, passenger entrance." "In there." She motioned at the door. Gavin, a step in advance, ducked inside and went ahead down a long incline until he fetched up in a moldy, unused waiting room. "Take the door to the left." A sign above it read, "Management, private." At the girl's direction, Gavin passed through bare offices, smelling of stale air and mildew, and into a narrow corridor which led straight as an arrow into the distance in either direction. Walls, ceiling, and floor radiated a pale green glow from the fungus. Gavin, who had been keeping a sense of direction with an effort, realized that the passage led toward Pit 9. They followed it for a quarter of a mile, passing only one intersecting corridor. They turned in the second passage they met, passed along it a short distance, and came out in the maw of Pit 9 itself. They were on a balcony 100 feet from the floor of the pit. The well below was charred black by countless jet blasts. The Nova, a dull black, bullet-shaped monster, rested on its jets, towering straight up 400 feet above them. He saw an airy gangplank sloping from the balcony to an open port in the ship. There was a glum Venusian standing guard at the gangplank. Urged along by the girl, Gavin ascended the gangplank into the ship itself. "I've heard of Shanghaiing," he remarked over his shoulder, "but this is the first case of being shanghaied exactly according to your wishes." Nadia said, "Captain Cabot will talk to you." She indicated an elevator, and they ascended rapidly to the ship's control room. There were 3 men in the spacious control rooms: Captain Cabot, the senior astrogator, and a communications man. They faced about, stared at Gavin as the girl prodded him through the door. "I found him in the Temple of Joy," said Nadia. Cabot's glance slid over Gavin. His lean, wolfish face cracked into a smile. "I haven't time to question him now," he began, when the communications man interrupted. "He's up there," said the communications man, "directly overhead, but he's beyond the Heaviside layer. I can't make out his class, but he's big. Feels like a patrol ship." A frown passed across Cabot's face. He snapped on a televisor. "Engine room," came a faint voice. Cabot glanced at his watch. "Taking off in 10 minutes. There's a ship above the clouds. Don't know who she is. Have all jets primed. We may have to dodge her." "Jack," said the voice. "And John," Cabot added. "I've got your third aboard. I don't care to trust him until we get beyond the 1,000-mile limit, though, so carry on for a while longer." "Jack," said the voice. Cabot snapped off the televisor and turned to Nadia. "Lock Mr. Murdoch in 17, then report back to the bridge." "Yes, sir," said Nadia. Gavin was led silently below again. He could hear the rumble of the warming jets. Nadia appeared nervous, jumpy. She wanted to get back to the bridge and an acceleration chair before the takeoff, Gavin guessed. About midway down, she paused before a metal door numbered 17, swung it open, disclosing blackness. Gavin stepped inside. The girl allowed her face to relax. She said in a softer voice, "Lay down. The Nova's takeoff is pretty rugged. 5 Gs." The metal door clanged shut. Gavin heard a bolt snick into place. Blackness, utter impenetrable blackness, engulfed him. He spent precious minutes searching for a light switch as the roar of the jets whined up an ascending scale. With a grunt of satisfaction, he found them, snapped them on. The cabin flooded with brilliance. The body of Trev, the Martian, was stretched stark and cold on the metal deck. Gavin bent shakily over the broker of slaves and scientific secrets. Trev's black eyes were open, glassy. A thin, three-cornered sliver of metal protruded from his throat. The Martian would never steal the Nova's space drive now. He had been shot with a poisoned dart. Suddenly a tremendous weight fell on Gavin's shoulders. He was squashed flat to the deck beside the dead Martian, pinned there. The breath was crushed from his chest, and he struggled wildly to inflate his lungs. The Nova, he realized in desperation, was off. Gavin managed to roll to his belly, push himself to hands and knees. The pressure didn't relax. He crawled to a corner, got his legs braced against a stanchion. If the strange ship above the clouds should prove unfriendly, the Nova would be bucking like a crazed steer in her efforts to dodge. Anyone caught unprepared would be flipped from bulkhead to bulkhead until he was a bundle of splintered bones. The acceleration dragged at Gavin's lean flesh. He looked 10 years older in the harsh bright light. Sweat burst from his pores, his eyelids drooped, his mouth sagged. Then the whine of the jets ceased. The terrific acceleration relaxed. Gavin felt like a toy balloon. Consternation widened his pale blue eyes. He gripped himself for the buffeting he was almost sure would follow. In the silence, a wild clamor broke out from stem to stern. The general alarm! Gavin tensed. He could feel the pulse drumming in his temples. Then it came. The jets burst into a full-throated roar. The Nova lurched crazily to the starboard and then swept upward at a tangent. Again the Nova bucked, this time to port. A sickening circular movement took possession of his prison. The ship, he realized, must be above the clouds in the upper stratosphere and climbing higher in tight spirals. Suddenly the Nova gave an uncontrolled lurch. A faint, faraway explosion reached his ears. They were being fired at. That was an atomic shell bursting off the starboard bow. Sweat coursed down Gavin's cheeks. Were they going to let him die in the locked cabin like a trapped rat? The crew could escape in space tenders if the Nova were hit. Another shell burst closer, throwing the gigantic ship sideways as a hurricane tosses a chip. Something burst in Gavin's brain. He came to his senses, realized he was hammering in berserk terror on the unyielding metal door. His knuckles were streaming blood. He got a grip on himself, forced himself to sit down again in the corner, back to the bulkhead, feet thrust against the stanchion. The body of the Martian, he saw, was sliding in erratic circles about the deck. Gavin wet his lips, his blue eyes desperate. He had scarcely settled himself when the third explosion burst. It was so close that there was no sound, only a terrific blast of pressure. The lights dimmed. Gavin was torn from his stanchion and hurled across the cabin against the opposite bulkhead. Fortunately, he didn't strike the unguarded steel. Instead, he was flung against the Martian's body, which acted as a pad. Even so, the shock was terrific. Blackness welled up behind his eyes. He lost consciousness. Gavin opened his eyes and realized he couldn't have been unconscious but a second or two. He sprang to his feet and struck his head and shoulders on the ceiling. He gave himself a push from the overhead and floated slowly back to the deck. Then he realized what was wrong. The jets were quiet. A silence so absolute that it rang in his ears blanketed the Nova. In all that ship there was no sound anywhere. The Nova was falling free, falling back to the surface of Venus. Chapter 4. The skin was stretched taut across Gavin's gaunt features, the freckles standing out like pennies. The air, rapidly growing denser, began to whine like the keening for the dead. He stiffened, straining to catch the sound he had imagined. It came again. The cough of a rocket tube. A wild hope flamed in Gavin's blue eyes. The roar of the jets blasted into life. The cabin heeled sharply to starboard. Gavin slid down the sloping deck until he fetched up against the bulkhead, which had suddenly become the floor. The Nova, he realized in a flood of relief, had come out of the fall and was speeding parallel to the surface. He sat down, his joints turning to water. He had a violent urge to be sick. Gavin's first belief that the attacking ship had been one of Terra's patrol spacers gave way to doubt. In the first place, the Nova hadn't been beyond Venus's 1,000-mile limit. Furthermore, he didn't believe a Terran patrol ship would have waylaid the Nova outward bound when she was innocent of her cargo of slaves. Then who was it? He heard a bolt click back. The door through which he had entered was directly overhead. The Nova, though, had been constructed for flying either keel on or stern down. The passages which previously had been horizontal were now vertical, and the vertical wells running from bow to stern lay horizontal to the angle of flight. A door which had been overhead when they were shooting straight up now was directly across the cabin. As Gavin watched, it swung open. Nadia Petrovna was framed in the opening. She said in a breathless, tight voice, "You've got to take over the engine room. Half the black gang are dead or laid up. Captain Cabot sent me to fetch you." Her hair, Gavin saw, had come undone and fell about her bare white shoulders like an inky cloud. A trickle of blood drew a crooked red line from a cut above her left eye, down across her high cheekbone to her small pointed chin. One of the rose plastic breastplates had been torn completely away, and the rose gown was split up her left hip from sandal to belt. Gavin plunged for the door. "This way!" Nadia started aft at a run. "The ladder! The elevators are stalled!" "Chief engineer," Gavin grunted. "Where's the chief?" "Unconscious. Concussion. Don't know how serious." She flung back at him as she dashed along the corridor, her torn skirt streaming out behind her. "The first is dead. The second has a broken leg." She reached the emergency ladder and threw herself down it with reckless abandon. Gavin followed a little more cautiously. The engine room, Gavin saw when he and Nadia dropped to the deck, was functioning smoothly enough now, although there was no evidence of the explosion. A smear of blood against a bulkhead caught his eye, then a twisted body lashed to the deck. But a jetman, a yellow Venusian girl, naked to the waist, was at her post beside the quartzite windows of the tubes. Sweat poured off her in rivulets as she watched the color of the explosions to check the mixture. The master mechanic, a fat Terran, was at the bridge televisor. He gave Gavin a relieved glance. "Bridge calling, sir." Gavin jumped to the televisor. He saw the lean, wolfish profile of Captain Cabot on the screen. Cabot's cheek had been laid open to the bone. One arm swung uselessly. His features were bleak as granite. Gavin said, "Murdoch reporting, sir." "Take over, Mr. Murdoch." Cabot's voice sounded harsh, metallic through the instrument. "We're describing an orbit about Venus at an altitude of 7 kilometers. Jack, is Miss Petrovna there?" "Yes, sir." "Let me speak to her." The girl approached the televisor. Captain Cabot ordered her in a terse voice. "Stay with Murdoch. If he shows any signs of treachery, shoot him." "Yes, sir," said the girl. She plucked the tiny dart gun from the spring clip on her leg, where it had been visible through the rent in her skirt. "You heard my orders, Mr. Murdoch." Cabot's cold voice issued from the instrument. "Stand by to fire the starboard two-bank. We're coming out of the clouds again." "Check." In spite of himself, Gavin couldn't help but admire the coolness of Josiah Cabot. He turned to Nadia. "What happened?" he demanded. The girl, her long black eyes serious, had her dart gun leveled at his chest. "I was at the scanner," she replied in an unsteady voice. "We cleared the clouds, making 5 Gs. The ship was right on top of us." "What ship?" She shook her head. "She wasn't a patrol spacer. She didn't identify herself. We dodged. Then she cut loose at us with atom shells. The 3rd shot did the damage. I don't know how serious yet, but half the crew are laid up. Captain Cabot cut the jets, which allowed us to fall back into the cloud bank as if we'd been knocked out." That was quick, shrewd thinking, Gavin realized. The bridge televisor whistled shrilly. "Bridge calling," came Cabot's voice. Engine room. Starboard jets, half blast. Check. Gavin pulled the lever on the control board. Starboard jets! He yelled above the sudden roar to the half-naked jetman. The Nova began to nose upward in a slow arc. Prime all tubes, came Cabot's crisp voice through the audio. We'll be above the clouds any moment. Check, said Gavin. A mounting tension gripped them all as the seconds dragged past. Then the televisor whistled again. Cut starboard rockets. Half blast ahead. There was another pause, and Cabot added with a faint smile, We're through the cloud bank. No sign of the spacer. Nadia heaved a sigh of relief and leaned weakly against the ladder. Guess we lost her half around the planet, surmised Gavin. Course 37.22 by 5, came Cabot's voice once more. Proceed at 1G until we ascertain damage, that is all. Check, said Gavin. He snapped off the televisor. You can put that dart gun away, he advised Nadia dryly. The girl snapped erect. She whipped the dart gun in line with Gavin's chest again. I haven't been relieved, she began in a queer voice. The gun trembled. Her knees sagged. She swayed, sat down suddenly on the first rung of the ladder. What's the matter? She gave a short, half-hysterical laugh. Matter? I've had the pants scared off me, and you ask, what's the matter? She clenched her teeth, dropped her head in her hands. Her black hair fell like a veil over her face. Gavin snapped on the televisor. Engine room calling. Bridge, came Cabot's precise voice. Murdoch speaking, sir. Advise Miss Petrovna be relieved. She's suffering from shock. Cabot looked startled. He hesitated. Tell Miss Petrovna she's relieved. Carry on, Mr. Murdoch. Check. Gavin turned to the girl. You heard the captain. She nodded weakly. There was a large greenish bruise on the gleaming flesh of her shoulder, which Gavin hadn't noticed before. He said, You'd better go to your cabin. Patch yourself up. He raised a sandy eyebrow. That costume could stand a repair job, too. Nadia glanced at herself, at the missing breastplate, the ripped skirt, and wailed, Oh, dear, it's ruined. You're lucky that you're not, too, drawled Gavin dryly. Ruined me? She shot him a glance from her long black eyes. Why, Mr. Murdoch, I didn't know you were so impetuous, and fled up the ladder. Gavin stared after her. He made an uncomplimentary but expressive remark under his breath. The jetman and master mechanic stood their regular 4-hour watches, but Gavin went unrelieved. He spent the first 12 hours examining the Nova's space drive. He could discover nothing extraordinary about it. It was capable of driving the slave ship at an acceleration of 5 Gs, but several of the latest model Terran patrol spacers were able to do as well. It left him completely mystified. No great damage had been done the Nova, but besides sundry fractured arms, legs, and ribs, 7 men had been killed outright. The chief engineer was recovering from a light case of concussion. Gavin was the only qualified engineer aboard able to stand watch. He drank gallons of coffee during the next 12 hours, trying desperately to stay awake. He brooded over the fact that with one dead engineer and another laid up with a fractured leg, he and the chief would have to stand 4 on and 4 off during the entire 12 sidereal months, which was the minimum time required to make the crossing between Venus and Jupiter. At the conclusion of 34 hours, Gavin was groggy with fatigue. His eyelids felt like sandpaper. He was irritable as a bear. He cursed the jetman and master mechanic whenever they failed to jump fast enough at the rasp of his voice. His chin dropped against his chest. He snapped his head up, realizing he'd been asleep on his feet, and glanced at the chronometer. He had been on watch for 37 hours. Someone tapped his shoulder. Gavin swung around and rubbed his bloodshot eyes. A small, wiry man with his head swathed in bandages had descended the ladder without Gavin's hearing him. I'm Wilinowski, said the man in a cultured voice. "Chief Engineer, sorry I couldn't relieve you sooner." Gavin shook hands, feeling an almost uncontrollable urge to throw himself on the deck and sleep. He repeated the course and their acceleration mechanically. "Go on to your cabin," the chief urged. "Get a good sleep. We'll have to stand 4 hours on and 4 off for the rest of the voyage, but it'll only be 2 weeks." "2 weeks?" Gavin echoed. "But that's impossible, sir." His fatigued brain grasped at the puzzle confusedly, and then came up with an answer. "We're turning back to Venus?" "No." Wilanowski shook his head. "We're going on to Jupiter." "But that's a 12-month voyage." The chief patted his shoulder. "You haven't heard of the Little Death." He smiled. "Little Death?" Wilanowski nodded. "Never mind trying to understand now. You're out on your feet, Murdoch. I'll explain after you've had some rest, but take my word for it, we'll be setting the Nova down on Jupiter in 2 weeks." Gavin staggered to his cabin in bewilderment. He threw himself on his bunk without even bothering to remove his shoes. He thought, "Little Death? Jupiter in 2 weeks? That crack on the skull must have affected the chief engineer's mind." Then sleep descended on him like a shroud. End of Part 3.